but the depth that you talk about will have to be relied upon more. There are several eligible players for this squad, including the likes of Alessandro Cercati, Callum Neuenhoff, Cameron Pepignon, Nectar Triantis, and Patrick Yazbek as well, who were not released by their clubs and deemed unavailable for this tournament. Now, Jacob, this is not in a FIFA window. Clubs are not obliged to release players. And, why is that? So the tournament is 3 weeks long, first of all, so it can't fit into one of these mid-season FIFA windows. It's an Olympic qualifier, so it can't be held in the, quote-unquote European off-season. That's when the Olympics are. And even if you wanted to then go a year earlier, that's when the Men's Asian Cup is supposed to be. Then there's the issue of qualifying for an underage tournament 12 months ahead of time as well. And the fact that there's no true Asian off season, but there's lots of issues. So this can't be done in a time and space where clubs aren't playing football. There's no perfect solution, but this is the result of it. At least 6 players, 4 or 5 of them, which would have been in contention for a place in the starting 11.
Why is this always an issue with whenever we're talking about the Australian national teams, whether it's the youngsters or whether it's the seniors, that there's always something going on with players being blocked by their clubs from going and representing their country. It's almost sort of farcical at this point, and it's just to be expected now that, especially with the absolute wealth of players that we have playing overseas, that there are going to be clubs that go, yeah, no, we don't want you going over there. And it's a case of them, I suppose, taking that route of club football at this level is better for you than international football for an underage team, right? And you can think what you want of that, but that's the reality of the situation. It does suck because you've got, a bunch of players there that you just named who are incredibly talented. And like you mentioned, 4 or 5 of them probably would have been in contention for the starting 11. But I think that it's also an opportunity for some of the other players that, they might have been sort of on that list that maybe would have been cut if these guys were available. They get a chance now to maybe get some minutes and prove potentially why they should be there on merit anyway. So I think that it's a double-edged sword. It's good and bad, more bad than good, let's be honest, but it's the reality of football nowadays, in that clubs are going to take fewer and fewer risks where they can to keep players that are on their books healthy, fit, and playing at what they believe is the best possible level.
Christian, I want to pick out 2 names in particular. The first is Patrick Yazbek. Now, we saw him make his debut for the Socceroos a couple of weeks ago, but he's a name that they haven't even started their season yet, and the club is not allowing him to go and play in an underage tournament. So to think that, even if the tournament was played perhaps earlier in the season, there wasn't as much on the line for clubs at that time. Well, we've just seen Viking at the start of their season not allow a player to come. And the other example is Alessandro Cercati. He was probably going to be selected for the Senior Asian Cup team, but the line then was that we're not going to pick him now through this big portion of January, and we're going to hopefully build up some goodwill with Parma and allow him to play for the under-23s in April. Now, that hasn't eventuated, and I guess questions will now be asked of that initial strategy to not include him in that first tournament.
Yeah, and I think the other reason to that, if not mistaken, was if Chikati was to join the Asian Cup squad, then that might have risked his place in the starting 11, maybe for future games down the season. If I'm not stand corrected, Lockie, I'm pretty sure that was another reason.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, but just like a couple of players that you mentioned there. I mean, obviously, they've experienced a bit of international football already. They know what it's like to play for the national team, but at the end of the day, for clubs, it's all about the money, really. Like, they're contracted to wages. It's pretty big nowadays, even for a club like Viking, for example. The money is just, it's different to what it was 10, 15 years ago when players, were opting to play for the national team ahead of club commitments, and the clubs would probably be a bit more willing to let their players go. So, I think it's just all financially impacted at the end of the day.
Jacob, is it perhaps as simple as the under-23s aren't worth it?
I think that's how some clubs would probably view it. And it sort of depends on what stage they think the players are at in terms of their development. If they're breaking through into the the first 11 and they're getting solid minutes, then I think the teams are probably going to reason that they're playing at a higher level than an under-23s continental tournament is, you know. But for players that are sort of maybe, again, not quite established, I think it could be, Christian mentioned financial reasons, it could be, you know, the risk of injuries, things like that, because they're always an unknown with international tournaments, or international football rather. So, yeah, it could be a combination of things. I don't think it's as simple as all the clubs going, yeah, nah, under 23s aren't worth it. Because if it was, you know, players from their natural leagues, you know, so like Brighton, if it was an English player, they probably wouldn't go, nah, we don't think that under 23s are not worth it. It might be, maybe, hot take, it might be a little bit of bias against Australian football here, going maybe the level the Australian team is at isn't good enough. But yeah, I mean, who knows? Unless any of the clubs come out and say directly, which I highly doubt they would, then we're never going to know, and it's just going to be speculation. And we could go on about this forever, and we will probably continue to, you know, in the future when more and more squads are announced and this sort of thing keeps happening.
And this is just going to be a further effect of more Australians playing in Europe as well. It's interesting you bring up Brighton, because Cameron Pepillon is an interesting example as well. He's been occasionally on the bench for Brighton. He's played some minutes in the PL2. He's come off. He's played in the FA Cup as well. But apart from that, Christian, he's not involved in the senior team, right? And he's one of these players that's been blocked from coming. So is the PL2 not even at the level where they'd say, okay, an under 23 can go away for Australia?
Yeah, man. Yeah, I just don't know, to be honest, anymore. Like Jacob said, I think I'm just a bit lost at the moment. Like, you just don't know. I mean, like, clubs are going to have their different reasons, right? I mean, like we touched on, financial implications, injuries. Maybe they just don't see fit for players to go over there for specific tournaments. So, yeah, it's a range of things, really. But yeah, it goes back to that discussion about how important is international duty, you know, especially for these younger players coming through. Because just say for one player, for instance, if they don't, if they're not exposed to much international football, will that sort of harm their progression? You know, Jacob touched on Jude Bellingham overseas, for example. Obviously, that hasn't impacted him. You know, he's been sort of slotted straight into the senior lineup, but for other players, it could be different. So, again, it sort of depends.
Yes, well, I guess, you know, that's the squad that we have, and we've talked about the issues behind it, but I guess moving forward, we just have to get behind the squad. Their first game is on the 15th of April at 11 p.m. That is a Monday against Jordan, and then games against Indonesia and Qatar round out the group stage as well.